From the very beginning,
what we can see going on.
Housing, infrastructure, hospitals, this was completely destroyed.
Clearly, this is not unintended.
It's not fine. It's absolutely not fine.
Systematic attack on.
I would determine.
Most of us are now saying
the wide agreement.
Widespread sense that
what is happening at the moment in Gaza.
Live streamed.
Very squarely fit in with the UN Convention of.
Is without a doubt.
The only inevitable conclusion
is a very, very cruel and heinous genocide.
Probably a genocide.
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 Genocide. Genocide.
Genocide.
Textbook case of genocide.
Israel was committing genocide in Gaza.
אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק.
אין שם בלתי מעורבים, אין שם תמימים, אין שם לא אשמים.
כי אנחנו נפעל בכל מקום ובכל העוצמה.
אנחנו נלחמים בחיות אדם.
Legally, I think there is what is needed is an intent to destroy in whole or in part the group as such. That's the core of the legal definition.
אנחנו נשנה את פני המציאות ברצועת עזה 50 שנה קדימה.
We will fight until we'll break their backbone.
We have seen that since very early on, immediately after the 7th of October, statements made by Israeli political and military leadership concerning the destruction of Palestine, the destruction of the Palestinian people, the starvation of the Palestinian people. So very overt statements of intent. But we can also prove that intent through looking at a pattern of conduct. And so what we do is we take that pattern, not just from the 8th of October, but from prior to that, for the many years before that. And we look at what has been going on.
The UN has a very strict definition of what constitutes genocide. It requires that there be not only genocidal actions, but also genocidal intentions.
We have seen right from the beginning statements of incitement to genocide as well as expressions of genocidal intent, denying the existence of innocents in Gaza and calling for the elimination of Gaza, the extermination of Palestinians, the flattening of Gaza, the burning of Gaza.
The war is not on Hamas, and it was never on Hamas. It was on the Palestinians in Gaza, and now we see it clear in our face. When the policy is not to expel Hamas, but to expel all Gazans, according to the Trump Riviera plan to expel all Gazans out of Gaza. If this is the official Israeli policy, then it's a war on the Palestinians, it's not a war on Hamas. And now we reached a point where Israeli government and much of the Jewish Israeli population in Israel think that they have the final solution to the Palestinian problem, at least in Gaza. So for me, it is undoubtedly a genocide. The rhetoric in Israel, from bottom up and top down, and to the right and to the left, the rhetoric was completely genocidal. We have to destroy. It's not about precision, it's about destruction. There is no innocent, a total siege. There is no... and the volume of dehumanization was so disgusting.
This concept of medical shielding, like human shielding, and evacuation zones, like giving this impression that Israel was letting them flee to a safe zone. There were no safe zones, there were death zones. Palestinians were moved around, ping-ponged, and then corralled in areas that would be killed or they would die anyway because they've been pushed.
Systematic destruction of these basic necessities of life, in combination with statements from Israeli officials, people sitting in the government about what the intention is, which is basically to get rid of people that live in Gaza.
And in most cases of violence that is deemed genocidal, we often don't have those explicit statements by political and military leaders declaring that they're going to be going after civilians, that they're not going to be distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants, that they're holding all members of a particular population somehow responsible and therefore targeted for this kind of violence. But we see that in this particular case.
We can think about the well-known Benjamin Netanyahu's description of the Palestinians in Gaza as Amalek, the biblical story.
You must remember what Amalek has done to you, says our Holy Bible.
The descriptions of Palestinians in Gaza as Nazis, but we have, these expressions of intent to destroy, which also included a lot of dehumanization, as is, again, very well known. Yoav Gallant's total siege proclamation infamously described Palestinians in Gaza as, quote, human animals. These are not expressions that are, in the heat of the moment after the Hamas attack, 7th of October, but they're ongoing for 19 months now. First live-streamed genocide. That is the first unfolding case of genocide now over 19 months that is so well documented while it unfolds. It's documented by the victims, the Palestinians who are facing the genocide. It's documented by aid workers, by doctors, journalists on the ground that, of course, Israel has also killed very systematically. But it's also documented in real time by the perpetrators, by the Israeli soldiers and officers on the ground who have documented their own crimes, recorded their own crimes and their narratives about their own crimes, and uploaded them proudly, right, to the internet. And we have thousands of these videos. Now, why are they important? Because these videos offers us an opportunity in many cases to show how soldiers and officers on the ground are actually understanding the genocidal intent on the leadership level. And it's very important on genocide, in the crime of genocide in international law, to show that there is intent on the leadership level, but it's also understood as it is intended on the ground, and it shapes actually the dynamics of the violence on the ground.
I consider this a genocide because genocide is the deliberate destruction of a group, a population or society. And in this case, Israel very clearly deliberately intended to destroy Gaza in a comprehensive way. Not only by killing a lot of individual Palestinians, but also by destroying the whole society, by destroying the health system, by destroying the schools, by destroying the mosques, the churches, all the social infrastructure which held Gazan society together, and by expelling most of the people from their homes, by destroying these homes.
We would be looking at the mass killings, obviously, is number one, but also injuries, so causing serious bodily or mental harm. But even going beyond that, we're looking at the destruction of healthcare facilities. We are looking at the destruction of essential infrastructure like electricity and water plants. We are looking at the restriction on humanitarian aid, which in this case covers food, water, and healthcare, things like medicines. Because if you are denying people water, shelter, healthcare, and food, the outcome is inevitable. And we've seen that in past genocides. This kind of conduct is actually essential to the genocide process, in particular the denial of food and water. And what it creates is an obvious situation. What else are you trying to do if you deny people food other than starve them to death?
Now, I think everyone can see that Gaza has been destroyed, and along with it, many Palestinian bodies. The infrastructure has been destroyed, the agriculture has been destroyed. The destruction of the possibility of Palestinian life in Gaza is obvious for everyone to see. Clearly, this is not unintended.
Deliberate destruction of Gaza. Gaza does not exist anymore as a collective, with institutions. The Palestinian in Gaza was completely destroyed. This is the distinction between mass killing and genocide. Genocide is a crime, is an act to destroy a collective. And this is what we see. To deliberately destroy so many houses. More than 70% of the buildings were destroyed, and not only by air bombs, by explosions and bulldozers who systematically razed down all the houses. In Rafah, in Jabalia, in other places.
And the fact that there is no place for Gazans to flee, unlike other scenes of genocide historically, where there were other borders or nearby states where the survivors of the genocide or the civilians can seek shelter. Here we have a small and densely populated area that has been relentlessly bombed by the equivalent of several nuclear bombs so far.
I think in the last couple of months, it became increasingly clear to me that what we're looking at is probably a genocide because of the pattern of violence that we see. So the repeated attacks on hospitals, on schools, the inability for people to reach food, attacks on desalination plants, difficulty on reaching water. So basic necessities of life. And again, as the statements from Israeli officials became, I would say, more open and more extreme about what the intentions are, which is basically to kick out much of the population and seize control of the territory. So I think those, and just reading about, the consequences of the deprivation of food and medicine and, the consequences that had for civilians, I think sort of pushed me more and more in the direction where I felt comfortable saying that I think what we're seeing is genocide.
So we had those days, the intense bombings, the carpet bombings of the entire Gaza Strip that began immediately after the 7th of October. 2023, and we have to remember that October 2023 was the most lethal month of the attack, right? In these intense bombings, we had the conditions of total siege and their almost immediate impact on Palestinians in Gaza. And these are the conditions in which Israel now ordered Palestinians to evacuate more than a million people from the north to the south. In addition to that, in the context of the bombings, we also know that Israel was actually using its most destructive 2,000-ton bombs, US-made bombs, to bomb the routes and the areas that it had designated as safe. Since then, until today, is that already in the evacuation order of 13th of October, under conditions of carpet bombings of the entire Gaza Strip, the targeting of the safe routes and the safe areas. We know that the most intense bombings were actually in the south that Israel had designated as safe in October 2023. And the total siege proclamation, right? Already actually, in the language of the UN Convention, quote, created conditions calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part. And it's important to say this is exactly what Israel then did.
And so I think, if you look at what is happening in Gaza, you look at the almost total destruction of Gaza, you look at the tens of thousands and maybe more deaths in Gaza. You look at the systematic destruction of the health system, of the cultural institutions, education institutions. You look at the kind of blockade that Israel has placed in Gaza and its implications for the Gazans. I think it's very hard not to call it a genocide.
Criticism that I faced after publishing that piece was, how come you talked about genocide so early on, only days, a week, less than a week after the Hamas attack on Israel on 7th of October. Well, that is the reason, because as I'll turn to now, I actually saw evidence for genocide already then, but also in any case, because there's an ethical issue that is very important in Holocaust and genocide studies, but also in the language of the convention, which is the idea of preventing genocide.
The question of who gets to decide whether or not Israel's actions constitute a genocide is a very, very tricky one. And it's complicated in part because of how the UN Convention of Genocide was created in the first place. It was created as a political act by the world powers who, on the one hand, wanted to call out this newly identified crime that had come out of the experience of World War II and the violence of Nazism and the Holocaust. But at the same time, they wanted to shield themselves from ever having to be accountable for such crimes. Within scholarly circles, there's a very widespread sense that what is happening in Gaza right now constitutes a genocide, certainly among scholars of genocide. Part of the problem is that we've elevated the term genocide and the concept of genocide to such a level that we almost always equate it with the Nazi Holocaust itself. And so any level of violence that doesn't rise to that amount of killing that happened during World War II gives people sort of the opportunity to say, well, that's not yet a genocide, and so therefore they don't need to intervene. All the while we're seeing that tens of thousands of Palestinians are being killed.
So the first genocide that takes place in a settler colonial context that gets litigated before an international court.
Now we need to remember that these provisional measures are attempts by the court to say you should not do X and Y, otherwise there is a risk of genocide. So the fact that Israel violated these tools that were supposed to prevent genocide is in itself an indictment of Israeli actions and shows that what was a risk of genocide, if these actions were implemented, becomes a genocide over a long time.
The purpose of the convention is to prevent genocide. If you wanted to wait till the dust is settled and all the people are dead and in the ground or have been ethnically cleansed, it's a bit late, and then it becomes a purely academic and legalistic argument, but not one that's related to protecting human beings.
There were checks and balances to prevent this, and I have really a heavy heart thinking of the Palestinians who have perished, on top, of course, of the Israelis and others who have perished, but also the Israelis who have committed these violent acts. Most of them are young people. What have they done? They will have to live their entire life with the vivid memories of the bodies they have crushed, the babies and they have killed, the children they have shot in the head, the thousands they have let starving, the hundreds of thousands they let homeless, the millions they've entrapped and killed and genocided for 403 days now, calling them animals, celebrating the misery they were inflicting upon them. It's grievous, isn't it?
There is no excuse or no justification for committing genocide. So you cannot argue we are defending ourselves by committing genocide. That is simply not an option.
It's going to be a stain on Jewish and Israeli history for generations to come. I wanted to believe that we are capable of many things, but not genocide. But here we are. Yes, it is a genocide. It is a very, very cruel and heinous genocide.